This is the Course of Action podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Clark. My debut book, Hear These Truths, the ultimate guide to building your leadership algorithm, is available now wherever books are sold. Check it out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and for signed copies, go to jeffclarkofficial.com and get in touch. Don't forget to follow on social media, leave a 5-star review for the book, and hit that subscribe button for the latest episode notifications. And as always, enjoy the episode. All right, and we're live. I got Marty Strong, author, CEO, and retired Navy SEAL on the show today. Marty, welcome.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah. Hey, pretty awesome having a Navy SEAL on the show. I've never really sat down and talked to one, so this is a cool moment for me, but I want to say thank you. And I know you got some family members that are currently serving. We just talked off air about it a little bit. And my son's in the Air Force. I was in the Air Force, and I think it's really cool to see how deep a military connection can kind of go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, my oldest son and my nephew.
Yeah, that's
both
really
Air Force.
Cool. And at Hill Air Force Base too, right?
Yeah, and then my brother was Navy, my father was Navy, my great uncle was Navy in World War II. So,
yeah, long lineage. That's cool. So let's talk about retired Navy SEAL officer. So when you retired from the SEAL teams, you went out into kind of corporate America. How did you went to like the financial and investment industry, right?
Correct. Yeah, I did half my 20 years as an enlisted SEAL and was an E7 when I went to Officers Candidate School. I had an undergraduate degree in business, which, prerequisite to go to Officers Candidate School. And then later on got my master's in management before I retired. And I thought I wanted to manage money. First, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. So I took the LSAT and was getting all set up for that just before I left the service. And somebody talked me out of that and talked me into financial services. So that's where I ended up for the first 7.5 years out of uniform.
And then, so what was it like as a retired Navy SEAL who, you were obviously in the 90s, and then 9/11 hits in September of 2001. What was it like kind of seeing things change for you from kind of an outside perspective, watching, your guys, your team, your brotherhood kind of go into battle in a way where you maybe have never seen that before?
Yeah, so I came in right as Vietnam had ended. So Vietnam was about 2 years done as far as, U.S. involvement. SEALs were in there pretty much to the bitter end, but the SEAL Team 2, the command I first reported to, was about like 95 out of 105 were all Vietnam veterans, most of them multiple tour. And then we didn't have anything for a long time. We had Grenada and Panama and Desert Storm and some other things. I saw all my combat action in the invasion of Panama, and I stayed on for follow-on operations. And by the time I was an officer, so the far and few between, National Command Authority deciding to invade, not invade. SEALs were involved in things in Lebanon after the barracks bombing, and in a few other places around the world that nobody would have heard about, but we were going in and do what we had to do and get out. A lot of rescues, things like that. So when 9/11 happened, it was, a shock to everybody. But for me, I was sitting in an office at United Bank of Switzerland in Maryland and talking to one of the VPs about something, and he had a TV on with the sound off, and so he didn't see the first plane hit, but somebody came into the office and said, "Hey, a plane just hit the World Trade Towers." Well, everybody in the financial services industry, especially on the East Coast, for the most part, had either been in or out or knew people that were in and out of those trade towers, and that office was no exception. So we turned up the sound and we kept talking, and then the second plane hit. And there was another gentleman in there with the VP, and I just looked at both of them. I said, "We're at war." And they went, "What do you mean?" That was deliberate. That
This
was
is an act of war.
that was an attack on a symbol of the United States. Somebody just declared war on us, whether it's a terrorist attack or whether it's terrorists being used by a major adversary to start and disrupt us and mess us up. So from that point on, for about the next month, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing in my mind what was going on back at the teams. I knew the drill. I'd been through it multiple times. Everybody getting recalled in, everybody getting into the biggest room in the building, getting the initial intel dump, the initial warning orders, the initial personal logistics to get your stuff ready,
Hmm.
not knowing if you were going to be tasked, where you might go if you were tasked, and everybody eyes glued to the TV set, waiting for some kind of an indication that would give a hint of where you might go or if you might go. And in the previous administrations, most of those types of events were short duration in and out, and but they weren't caused by something this dramatic. So I think, first off, I reached back and I tried to find out if I could get back in, but I have a disability from a parachute accident, so I couldn't get back in. I had kids in high school and everything. So ultimately, what I did about 3 or 4 months later is I started a process of selling my book of business to somebody else in UBS and try to get into the counterterrorism world in some form or fashion. So for a couple of years, I ended up working for different companies, looking at the Port of LA, LAX, Bureau of Printing and Engraving in DC, different infrastructure targets in the United States. I ended up on the kind of threat profile team in Athens for the Athens Olympics in 2004, trying to figure out what the bad guys were going to do, when they were going to do it, anticipate those things ahead of time. And it was something I could contribute. And eventually, I ended up in Iraq for 7 months, helping the State Department, same kind of thing. And then during the beginning of the insurgency in 2004, and then I came back. And when I came back, it was pretty much the war was on autopilot, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the counterterrorism, anti-terrorism thing was kind of fading because we had a pretty good handle on attacks against the U.S. So it was more about war fighting in those places. So I ended up getting picked up by a defense company, started doing defense work as a VP, and did that for the next couple of years until I was pulled into a small company as a part owner and started building that. And that I'm still the CEO of that structure. This is the 13th year, but it's an employee-owned enterprise. It's got two different companies, a healthcare company and the original government contracting company. So yeah, that was kind of the what happened when the planes hit, and then feeling like a loser because I couldn't get in there to fight, and then trying to do whatever I could to help with the fight.
So, what was it kind of like emotionally? You've got some business going, and then all of a sudden that happens, and you kind of got this tug of war inside of, I want to go back in, but I can't. I want to help out, but how do I? But I also got to focus on kind of what I'm doing right now and my new future. What was it kind of like emotionally to kind of go, I guess I am going to have to kind of sit this one out and play my role.
Well, I'd spent a couple of years struggling to build my book of business and my client base, making a lot less in the first couple of years than I made in the Navy by a long shot. It was all commissions and fees. There was no salaries involved. So if you didn't have clients and you didn't attract their money, you didn't invest it well, you
Okay.
didn't grow. So at this point, I've been doing this for 6.5 years essentially, and I had passed the struggle part, and I was successful, and I was making all the money I needed to make. But the weirdest thing is when I drove, it was about a 45-minute drive from the office that I was in when we were watching the attacks on TV to where I live, and I felt like what I was doing for a living wasn't worthy anymore.
Mm.
And the odd thing is that I was making rich people richer, and I was making people that were moderately wealthy more wealthy, and I was doing well. And it just seemed like the entire exercise, the purpose, the goals of the exercise, paled in such significance to what was going on the other side of my brain, which was how do I get in? How do I contribute? I just and that stuck with me as I was watching this stuff on TV. I just kept thinking, I don't want to be doing this with my life when this is going on. So that's why I eventually figured out a way to sell my book of business and transition out and start doing the only thing I could do, which was the counterterrorism advisory type work.
And I think something that I really try to help out with a lot of other veterans, and I volunteer with the vets to industry. And I think something that is a big part of the transition is finding an identity and finding kind of that purpose. And I see a lot of veterans struggle with it because they go out and they get a job, they do the resume thing, and they get all the stuff correct, and they get a job and they get a 9 to 5, and then they ask themselves, "Am I doing something worth anything? Is this fulfilling?" And they struggle with that because um it's not. Or they see their buddies still in, and they see their unit on TV, and then they just question themselves, like, was this the right choice?
Yeah.
um it's definitely difficult. And I could see the dilemma there with you, of course. 20-year war, and the special operations community was a massive part of that, and I could see where that's a bit of a struggle.
Sure. I mean,
But
I was fine with the decision to leave after 20. The op tempo was, ridiculous. It was you were gone 49 out of 52 weeks training, and then you took off for a 6 month deployment to pre-stage someplace. Then you came back and started the whole thing all over again. And all the training was all around the country. It wasn't at home. So, I had little kids, and I wanted to, have a little bit of an experience being a dad, being
right.
around them and everything.
Yeah.
So, I made peace with myself, and I was good. I basically had a good severing psychologically until that second plane hit, and then I instantly felt like, okay, I got to figure out
Yeah.
how to get back
It's go time.
in the harness. I got to figure out a way to do it. And I talked to all kinds of guys. That I just had a little mini reunion with some of the guys that served with me a couple of days ago. And when you sit down and talk to each other, and you haven't seen each other for 10, 15, 20 years, a minute or two later, you realize it's like you never were apart. I mean, you're picking up each other's sentences, you're laughing at the same jokes, everybody remembers all the stories. And that's a big part of what veterans reminisce about, and or they don't, and they miss it, and then all of a sudden they're back in that environment for even a short period of time,
Hmm.
and then they realize what isn't a part of their life anymore. That close intimacy and that willingness to commit to somebody else, 100%, and vice versa. And you don't find it outside. I mean, maybe law enforcement, EMTs, firefighters, they see that, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's a rare thing,
Yeah.
and you don't appreciate it as much when you're in as when you're out.
Yeah, I'll second that for sure, because and that's kind of why I really got into volunteering, was because I started to find that a little bit more, especially of volunteering with veterans organizations around other veterans that were also volunteering. I kind of found that a little bit more. So then the transition felt a little different, and I said, okay, I'm helping. I still have a purpose, but I still have to go to my 9 to 5. I got to pay the bills and all that. And so let's talk about out of the SEAL teams into the financial industry. You make the switch, defense contracting, and now all of a sudden, when did you get the idea to write a book? When did that come about?
So I've taught leadership probably since, I don't know, maybe probably started when I was an E6 in the SEAL teams. I mean, we all train each other, and you're training the officers, one, right? The enlisted
Mm,
guys are always trying to make sure the officers don't make mistakes, more than a few mistakes. And then you're training the new enlisted guys coming up. And in special ops, everybody ends up having to be a leader and a follower. You have two-man teams, somebody's leading. So the leadership responsibility, accountability, et cetera, starts really early in that organization. So teaching what leadership is, kind of the quack like a duck rule. You know it when you see it, and you know it when you don't see it. Doing leadership inventory and surveys of different individuals to figure out what, kind of gap analysis. What are their strong suits, and what are they weak in? And then try to maintain what they're good in, and shore up what they're weak in. And eventually, as an officer, when I first started, I was back to being, an ensign, or, like a second lieutenant in the Army or the Air Force. And nobody was asking my opinion about anything. Nobody was asking me to teach anybody leadership. But pretty quickly, because I was a senior enlisted guy before, I was being sought out by other officers, my own peer group, but also people that were a little more senior to me, and eventually more senior people like XOs and COs of commands, because I had 10 years of experience, operating experience in the SEAL teams. And that kind of grew into me, I guess, mentoring a lot of people. And so it was kind of natural for me to do it. When I started managing money, I think that was a part of my style with my clients. I did, I did essentially, I planned out their wealth, journey. I did contingency planning. I did risk mitigation, and I led them like a leader. And then I
Hmm.
taught them how to be resilient and understand the plan was there for a reason. And turn the TV off if people start getting crazy. And then when people did get concerned, I would take every phone call, meet with anybody until the last person was spoken to, like in the 2000 crash, NASDAQ crash. And a lot of other guys didn't do that. A lot of guys, shut the phone off or walked out the door and hid someplace. So leadership's always been a part of what I did. And as I started getting into business, the same kind of thing happened. I started working at a low level in a company. Low level, I was a director, but eventually, even the president started seeking me out for advice. At this point, I was starting to shift into more strategic advice, more
Okay.
long view,
Yeah.
more, when should you pivot? What are the signs to pivot? What kind of trauma is the organization going through as it's trying to scale? Because nobody planned on the scaling; they're just kind of doing it on the fly.
Yeah.
And so I became really adept at analyzing multiple divisions of a company and eventually multiple companies associated under different leadership and ownership structures to see what was wrong, see what was right. Same kind of thing I was doing, as a E6 and a SEAL teams, just on a much, uh, I guess, larger scale and with money involved instead of lives. So that's kind of the path. And eventually, there were people that left that company and other people that I met, and they started asking me to mentor them for advice, et cetera. So it was an ongoing process. Back in 2017, um, 2019, I decided, after a couple of conversations with CEOs, they were founder CEOs, I thought, they all seem to be appreciating what I'm saying and they all seem to be using it and it's effective. Maybe I should start writing this stuff down, because I
Yeah.
really wasn't. I was really just I wasn't charging anybody. I was just, well, let's have lunch, let's have breakfast, whatever.
Yeah.
So I sat down and said, okay, what am I going to write? What am I going to write down? Then I started thinking, well, why don't I do more than just write it down? What's the purpose of that? So codifying your own kind of mental approach and your intellectual approach, your emotional approach to business and leading and strategy and all that, it's a lot more daunting task than I thought it was going to be. Because what you're really doing is you're trying to say to you what you are all about, which is an odd thing. And I mean, other people could say, oh, thanks for this, you're really good at that, whatever. But when you sit down and really think about it, the first question that pops in your mind is, who's going to read this thing? Who's
Hmm.
going to listen to me? And after you take a deep breath and say, okay, I'm gonna put this on down on paper anyway. And I started doing it. And I started figuring out I wanted to make it a written mentoring session, like a written coaching session to leaders or aspiring leaders that were in high stress environments, meaning small companies, scaling companies, early stage companies, and or divisions in larger corporations that were having the same kind of dynamics in their organizations, because that's where leadership's really important. That's where a lot of the things that I am good at have relevance. And I chunked the thing out in kind of the order I wanted to introduce and make it build on, one chapter after the other. And lo and behold, I ended up having a book. So that was Be Nimble.
So here it is right here. So everybody can see if you're listening. It's called Be Nimble: How the Creative Navy SEAL Mindset Wins on a Battlefield and in Business. I usually have it posted up behind me, but for some reason today, the lighting is just horrible in my house. So I can't figure it out. But here it is: Be Nimble by Marty Strong. So, how did you kind of mesh the lessons from the SEAL teams into something, um, a word like nimble into kind of a leadership book? Because um, it's easy for like a guy like me. I understand the military lingo, but how did you go? I want to take somebody's SEAL lessons and development and wisdom and kind of civilianize it to where something people anybody could read. Anybody could pick this up and go, okay, I'm following what he's saying, other than the word SEAL.
So oddly enough, I'd been out of the teams long enough that I didn't start writing it thinking about anything being derived from my time in the Navy. But as I started putting, the words down, I started looking, okay, what are the origins of these thoughts? What are the origins of these behaviors of mine that I'm basically telling the reader they should emulate? And there were some that were clearly my character, my approach to leadership, my approach to talent management, all those things, problem solving, solution design, etc., stress management, and even strategic thinking. A lot of them, I realized, the roots were back in the SEAL teams. That's where I learned how to do a lot of that, and then I'd been applying those things because you don't dump that when you get out of uniform. I'd been applying those things incrementally as I got more and more involved in businesses, because in the beginning I didn't really have that many situations where I had to apply all of it.
Hmm.
But eventually, within about say 8 or 9 years of being out of the Navy, I was being asked to write business strategies. I was being asked to come up with a plan to deal with like a merger or a big expansion of services, or and the chaos and the crazy that's associated with that, and then all the fear of the change and all the dynamics. And I thought, okay, this is easy. It's just wading through a bunch of crazy, and that's part of the SEAL teams too. So that's where I started clicking with the subtitle, that there is a SEAL origin to not all, but a lot of the things that I write about in the book. And I think people are looking for something like that. They there's two different ways of looking at it, right? I can't do it because this is all about what SEALs do, and I'm not a SEAL. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way is, if this person is writing this book, are they saying that if you read this book, you can be like a SEAL when it comes to leading and handling stress, managing people, and all that? I took that second approach in the
Hmm.
way I formulated the conversation. I dropped in stories to make a point that was already made with maybe a business case and some learning tips and tools, and then I would throw in a SEAL story to kind of show where it was relevant, and it makes it a little entertaining. It's not a dry book. And I did that and punctuated the whole book with those kinds of things. Same thing with Be Visionary, the second book, because I think you can show. I mean, I love metaphors and analogies, and I think between telling somebody this is the problem we're going to address, here are the tools and tips and ways you can address the problem. Here's an example in business where this has been addressed. Say in my experience, here's an example where the same thing's been addressed when I was a SEAL. That's kind of the pattern through the whole book.
Okay.
So it's not read this book, you're a Navy SEAL leader, and it's because first off, the SEAL teams get their people just like all the services do, because Uncle Sam finds them, pays for all their training, and then delivers them to the leaders. And I've often said that, one of my guys, which on average is like $2 million of training and prep before they become an operator at about the 2 year mark.
Wow.
If one of my guys broke his leg, all I had to do is go down the hallway, knock on the door in the op shop, and say, "Hey, I need another one of those kinds of guys." And like a Pez dispenser, the next day they'd give me another guy just like that guy. I mean, 100% SEAL, 100% qualified in whatever his niche specialty area was. Perfect shape, great attitude, switched on. And that is not the way the regular world works,
Right. No.
right?
No.
So, so I think if I'd come right out of uniform and tried to write a book like that, I would have missed the whole point of that, because I would have been lecturing and giving sermons on how to be a leader without realizing that I was in a very unique and special situation as a leader, and managing and leading rare, people. And in the real world, you get the luck of the draw, you get the people you train, the people you hire and develop, and the subordinate leadership that you develop, train, and that you guide and mentor. It's on you. I mean, you really have to build the thing, create the thing, lead the thing, from day one to the day you stop being the leader of that organization. And much, much more challenging than being a SEAL leader.
And I think, to your point, no matter who you're given, whether it's corporate America or you're in the military and you get handed a well trained individual, you still have to lead them. You know, you still have to guide them. They're not going to necessarily do all those things on their own. I think that's a big thing I learned in the military was, when I became an NCO and I really started kind of really leading people. I look at some of my troops and be like, you're fully qualified. What's the problem here? And the problem wasn't them and their abilities. It was they have to be led. People have to be led. And it was something really, really important to me that I learned in kind of my growth was never take that for granted, never just assume. People of all shapes and sizes have different needs when it comes to that. And it's really something I've seen, working for the government and working in corporate America is the exact same thing is people have to be led. You have to lead people. You cannot just be like, okay, you're qualified. Come on, it's a unique set of circumstances. But what I want to ask you now is how did you come up with Be Nimble? The word nimble is a unique word, something maybe you don't hear as very often. How did nimble come into the picture?
Well, one reason was because agile was overused.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, being agile, mobile, nimble, intuitive, engaging, innovative. These are all things that are kind of the children of kind of the same core driver, which is, in my opinion, that is intellectual humility. If you have intellectual humility, if you seek answers with an open mind and without the baggage of your belief system, the baggage of the formulas you've been applying, almost like rote memorization, and it could be also with any failures that you've had recently. You basically have to clean your mind out of all the victories and failures so that you can stand there and be open-minded. And then because of that intellectual humility, then you can do the next thing I believe in, which is you can become intellectually curious. You start seeking answers from a lot of different sources. One of the problems in the military, especially in special ops, is you get fed the information and the intelligence. You don't really have an opportunity to seek out a lot of other ideas and a lot of insights. You can on tactics and weapons and things when you're not on mission mode. But once the mission mode starts, somebody says, this is the picture, this is the guy, this is the license plate, this is the house, there's going to be 4 guys there, this is the weapons, and then you get there and it's not like that at all. So then you have to improvise. But in business, especially nowadays, I mean, you have access to pretty much the whole world. I mean, you can watch, a free webinar on any subject or a free podcast or TED Talk on any subject. Nothing to stop you. You can do it on your own time. You can do it whenever you want to do it. You can ask people for advice. You can ask people for insights. Most people will just give it to you. And I'm not talking about just inside your organization. You should do it definitely inside your organization from the bottom to the top. You ask the truck driver at the loading dock what they think. You ask, the front desk receptionist what they think. You go around, you ask everybody, what do you think? What do you think is going on here? What would you like to see here? And then you do it with all the outside people, the asymmetrical input, the kind of weird, angles of information and data that you can collect if you start with being humble. And secondly, you allow yourself to be curious, actively curious. So the funny thing happens, if you do those two things in concert, you suddenly become more enlightened, more informed, and the aperture of solution design and problem solving opens much, much wider. And then the third step is intellectual creativity. Now you're poised to actually come up with something that might be unique, interesting, appropriate, because you've done these first two steps. If you try to jump right to creative and you're just bringing the football play from the last 2 times you've had to do something, you're basically applying a tunnel vision approach intellectually to a problem because you've already classified the problem, you put it into a category, you decided how it's going to be solved, and you're just using what you think will work the third or fourth time in a row.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not being creative at all.
Copy and paste kind of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
exactly.
And that's, something I kind of think about the old VCR tapes. You remember those where you'd record over it, several times, but then eventually, you recorded so many times over it that it started to become weak and it didn't record as well anymore. And it just kind of lost that effectiveness and quality. And I kind of think of it kind of as the same way as, sometimes, um, in business and in the corporate world, and even in government, now, we try to do the same things because it's easy, simple. Let's just do it again. And it doesn't work. And we often ask ourselves why. Like, well, why didn't it work? It worked last time. Well, not every situation is the same. And I really like the word nimble. It really caught my eye and really made me think. Like nimble, that's not a word I've seen, but you're right. Agile, it probably
And
gets used all the time.
and as I was writing it, I almost changed it to be humble because again, I'm codifying the way I approach things. So if you've never done that before,
Hmm.
why do you think the way you think? Why do you think the way you think in the order of the way you think? You have a 5-step, 7-step, 10-step. Why? What justifies it? What's the point of that? Where did you get that from? Why would you tell somebody else to do that? So you're constantly kind of reevaluating and studying yourself and dissecting these little steps and these little elements and the way you approach, in my case, leadership and business. And there's a in the book I make a distinction between management and leadership because in businesses, especially today, they don't teach leadership. And in colleges and business programs, they don't teach leadership. They teach management. They teach risk mitigation and management. And I define management as somebody who's in charge of making sure that all the systems, processes, and talent operate the way they're designed to. So and I'm not talking about a little problem, but if something falls apart, like if you have two key employees that walk out the door and you're in big trouble because they're linchpins, it's a single point of failure scenario. Managers are not the ones that are going to step up and try to figure out how to do the workaround to solve that problem because you have an emergency. Leaders are. So if
Right.
you have an organization that are all trained and educated and by experiencing, being good managers, they're moving up to the top, then you don't have any leaders from the top down. And you have nobody calling out for leadership. Nobody's expecting it to be a characteristic or an attribute. So I define leaders as those people, and you can be a manager who's trained to be a leader, but
Sure.
when something falls apart, you have to suddenly put your leadership hat on, take charge of the emotions that are swirling around, pull everybody in the room, say, okay, it failed. We're not going to have another system up for another 2 weeks. Let's solve this problem. Let's figure it out. What we've been doing for the last 2 years is over. Let's figure this out for the next 2 weeks until we figure out a more formal way of fixing this. When you do fix it formally, you get another system in or you hire 2 more people in and everything gets settled out. Well, now you're back to managing,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Steady state, metrics from the past applied forward, that kind of linear incremental way of thinking. And so that's kind of the hands-on leadership versus management. And then in Be Visionary, the second book, I talk a lot more about the leadership function and being strategic and looking out to the horizon and outside the skin of the building and not just sitting in the lifeguard stand waiting for the problem that you have to jump in and work on.
Well, let's talk about the second book. It's called Be Visionary: Strategic Leadership in the Age of Optimization. When can we expect that?
It comes out the middle of December this year.
Awesome. So
Yeah,
December.
it's available on Amazon for pre-sale right now.
Awesome. So you can go to Amazon, look it up, Be Visionary. Um, so you said kind of long-term strategic. How is this a build upon Be Nimble when it comes to leadership?
So think of Be Nimble as a functional guide, kind of being mentored in how to build and grow people, build and grow, evaluate yourself as a leader. knowing the distinctions between managing and leading, and kind of the order that you would put things together if you were stepping in to be a leader, evaluating systems, processes, and people, and then starting to make the changes and adjustments. So very mechanical under the hood
Okay.
for Be Nimble. Be Visionary was kind of the child of one of the chapters in Be Nimble. I had a beta reader, a CEO, who was reading Be Nimble chapters as I was finishing them and giving me feedback on what he thought. And what the email, the chapter that had the discussion of strategy, he sent me an email and said, "This could be its own book. The whole way you're positioning this could be its own book." So once you write a book and it goes through all the copy editing and everything, there's always a long time afterwards where they start a big long marketing thing, like 8 months of marketing. So you have time on your hands. So I started to flesh out what I wanted to do as far as a strategic book. But then I realized that that's not really the problem. The problem is you have to have a mindset where you're looking at the horizon, that you're comfortable looking at the horizon, and that horizon shouldn't be next week. That that horizon should probably be at least 6 to 12 months out. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but it's an exercise in almost like meditation. You sit down, you think, you do it personally and professionally. What do I want to be? What do I want to look like? Where do I want to be, professionally in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? Start to picture yourself the way you'd like it to be. If it's exactly the way you are, well, then you don't have anything to change. But if there's any changes, well, then how do I get there? How do I become that person? For an organization, the leaders are saying, how do I take ABC Corporation from where it is now to where I think it should be and what it could be in 18 to 24 months or 3 years? And then as you're looking at that horizon, you're thinking through the journey, you have to start anticipating both the opportunities that might be available for you, but also some of the threats and some of the risks that might be available for you. At that point, you've got kind of a fleshed out vision concept, but you don't have a strategy, and you definitely don't have a plan to get there. So what the book does is it talks about the human characteristics that lend themselves to thinking big thoughts, thinking in a visionary mindset, and why society, from the time you're, you know, probably 4 years old, you're in a constant state of learning rules. And it contains your curiosity, contains your creativity, and pretty much it's what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? Do it well, do it well, do it to standard. And schools do the same thing. So you get people that are visionary that don't do well in that, and they break out and they become artists and musicians and things. But because society is trying to contain that impulse that all kids have and kind of pound it out of them, it's not something you find very often in organizations. You find a lot of efficient engineering, management controls, risk mitigation. And then if you say to somebody, and I've done this often, but what's your strategy? What's your vision for the company? And they stare at you. Once in a while, they'll come up with a number like, oh, we think next year we should be able to improve our revenue by X%.
It's not.
That's like an accounting answer. That's not a vision
Yeah,
answer.
it's not a strategy. That's a goal.
So it starts with a little bit of introspection at the level of the individual in the beginning of the book, and then it goes into the role of a leader in being visionary and taking the time to think those thoughts. And then it goes into the mechanics of putting it all together, from taking the visionary concept, turning it into a strategy outline, and then creating an operational plan, basically a campaign plan to execute the milestones on the way to that strategy goal. And talks a little bit about how to do pitch sessions inside of a company to the resource managers, the people that have to say yes or no, how to use the different kinds of people you're going to run into in an organization. If you find people that are open-minded and creative, I call them the dream team in the book. Excuse me. I call them the dream team in the book. Use them to help flesh out the strategy because they're going to understand the concept and the visionary impact. If you have a bunch of naysayers, it ain't broke, don't fix it and all that, use them as the team that reviews the work. Let them shoot holes in it. Let them find the practical problems with it. So I explain all that in the book, and I think I end up with kind of an upbeat thing that, as long as you keep looking at the horizon, keep thinking big thoughts, and thinking in this way, one, you'll never be surprised, or you shouldn't be surprised by the risks and the threats out there. And two, those opportunities are out there for you as a person, as a professional, and as a leader of a company. Once you start to see them, you know when to jump through that door.
So let me ask you this one last kind of question before we wrap up. Um, in your experience, how well prepared was corporate America strategy wise for the pandemic?
I don't think, I mean, the way businesses are run, at least in the last 15 years, 20 years, I think very few companies or corporations were prepared for anything. It didn't have to be a pandemic. I don't think they were prepared for what was happening slowly and inevitably, which was this whole cloud-based, universe, and the remote work, remote interaction, like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
That was coming. That was starting to impact some industries. The pandemic just accelerated it. The technology was there. It wasn't like we had the pandemic and we waited a year for people to invent Zoom.
Right. It was
You
already
know,
there.
yeah. Um, so that was coming already, and companies weren't prepared for that. They would have been dragged kicking and screaming into letting their people live in another state and still work, quote unquote, through a remote process. So the fact that the pandemic hit caused everybody to, usually in black swan events, you have three different reactions. You go into denial, and you hope it's all going to go away. That's your battle plan. Those companies, those organizations, doesn't matter what the black swan event is, they always fail, fade, and end up being acquired, and at a lower value at some point by the other two groups. The second group goes into denial for a short period of time, snaps out of it, and realizes they have to figure out how to reinvent themselves because the world's not going to be the same. And the third group actually starts that way from the beginning. They basically, on day one, they're like, okay, the plane's crashed. Can't stay here. Let's grab everything we can carry that's useful from the plane. Let's start heading towards civilization. They don't sit there and, well, maybe somebody will find us someday. They go right to it. And
Hmm.
they're the ones that usually end up inheriting a lot of the market share of the
Yeah.
first group,
Right.
because you can't sit and hope that those things will go away and still succeed. So if you think of it in a smaller scale rather than a pandemic, it's the same kind of experience. If your competitor, does a leapfrog over your capabilities for your product or services, you know about it and you ignore it. You convince yourself, oh, ours is higher quality. Oh, all our customers are more loyal. And then they clean your clock and suddenly you're in trouble, 18 months later. I mean, big trouble. It doesn't have to be a big splash like a pandemic or 9/11. It can be something that's more incremental, or a surprise that came out of left field. But your competitor's been working on this for 2 years.
Hmm.
When they came out with it, you're 2 years behind and you're in denial that it's going to have any positive effect. Your competitor's not going to be able to really make any money. That happens in business all the time, all the time. So I think the organization that was the least prepared was the United States government.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I work for the government, and I can tell you, remote work and telework, that was a dirty word. That was a word that wasn't spoken. It was kind of thought of negatively. Um, it was a very underutilized concept. It was for very, 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 very rare occasions. And so when it first happened, and they were like, well, I mean, the president's saying only 2 weeks. Let's just send everybody home for 2 weeks, and you remote work. If computer works, great. If it doesn't, your orders were to go home and work. And it was just, it wasn't something I think they bought into that well. And then they eventually did. And I think almost 2 years later, my boss, who's a really high ranking civilian, said, I ate my words when it came to remote working. He's like, I'm 100% a believer now, because we not only went home and teleworked, we made progress on things like we've never made progress before. So he was like, you could just see it on his face. He was like, we missed the bus on that one for sure.
Well, 10 years from now, historians are going to look back and they're going to say, the fact that the United States government and all the state governments shut down, locked down the economy, locked kids and people in their homes, shut down education, flooded the United States with massive amounts of cash from the CARE Act and other things, which then led to a raging inflation that we hadn't seen since the 70s, and then supply chain problems, and maybe eventually a recession. So the whole course of events might be a 4-year, ailment
Hmm.
for the United States was self-inflicted. We didn't do that during the Spanish flu. We didn't do it through any of the other pandemics and endemics. So, I mean, if you think about it hypothetically, it's kind of like somebody says, "Hey, I think you stubbed your toe," and you go, "Oh, okay," and you go over and you pick up a pistol and shoot yourself in the head. I mean, the one's drastically unrelated to the other,
Hmm.
and whether it was fear, incompetence, lack of information, lack of insight on what would happen if you locked people up, I don't know, but yeah, I think that's 10 years from now, they'll look back and they'll say that the most disruptive thing of the pandemic wasn't the virus. It was the government's reaction to the virus,
Hmm.
which was unprecedented. We'd never done that as a country in prior academics and pandemics.
That's true.
So, which again, it's its own kind of strange black swan, because if you look, and I have a board, and we are trying to figure out what was going to go on in 2020. Is this going to go on forever? And I went back and did all this research on all the other pandemics. And I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen, because
Yeah.
the country never did this in the past.
Right.
If you were sick, you were quarantined. And, they worked on some kind of a vaccine or something until you were quarantined. Then they found it and they started getting people vaccinated. But they didn't, nobody called up Sears and Roebuck in, the 1940s or 50s and said, shut down, everybody shut down,
Yeah.
go home. And they didn't do that. So there was no precedent. There was nothing to compare it to. Yeah.
So last big question. In just a few words, define leadership.
I think leadership is having the clear sense of responsibility and accountability to take action when action is required, whether anybody else tells you to, or whether it's your job description or not. And if you are a leader, when those moments arise.
Mm. Oh, that's good. So, Marty Strong, thank you so much for coming on. Of course, you can get his book, Be Nimble, How the Creative Navy SEAL Mindset Wins on a Battlefield and in Business right now. You can, of course, get Be Visionary, his new book. You can pre-order it now, so go do that. And I'll let you have the final words. Drop your social media or website and tell them where they can find more about you.
Sure, the easiest way is to go to martystrongbenimble.com. Both the business books are there, my articles, my speaker page, all those things are all there. And there's links also to my novels. I've got 9 novels that I do as kind of a fun thing. So they're also on Amazon, and all the proceeds of my novels are donated to the SEAL Veterans Foundation, specifically to a program called MLAP, which works with PTSD and traumatic brain injury and things. So, and I've been doing that since 2017.
That's awesome. So go pick up all the novels for sure. Pick up Be Nimble and then pre-order Be Visionary, and know that your money's going to a good cause for sure. And I thank you very much for coming on, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.